would like to start. And as you know, today we have Dr. Rhodian Munyenyembe from Mzuzu University. He was the head of department up until, I think, late last year. And he's a great friend of mine. He was my boss when we were there, and I was at Mzuni. And I mean, a person that knows his stuff. And I was privileged one time when we traveled to Abuja, and I had a stomachache. And he's the one that nursed me those 2 days. Thank you so much for all your stuff. And of course, to say that what he's presenting is from that book that's coming from TSM, Decolonizing the Theological Curriculum in an Online Age, right? So that's a book over there. We still have some copies in stock. If anybody needs them, let's be in touch. I can organize you copies of them. And of course, this is part of the Theological Society of Malawi. We have a group that's called the Postcolonial and Decolonial group. It's a WhatsApp group. So once in a while we have something like this. And so it's an honor to have you, sir, Dr. Rhodian Munyenyembe. You have 20 minutes to make your presentation, and then we'll have a Q&A afterwards. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Felix. I just want to say that since this is just a chapter from a book, it's not new research as such. I presented it for the first time during the Theological Society conference at Ekwendeni. I think that was 2021.
Yes.
Yeah, and then after that, I did some editing here and there as guided by the editors and the reviewers. And then the chapter was published in this book. I have no idea why you decided that I should present this thing, but since I'm passionate about such things, let me present.
Thank you.
I don't know whether I was given a chance to introduce myself. Maybe.
No, I think you should. I think you should. But again, if you may also put on your video, that would be nice if you're able to.
Ah, my video.
Yes.
Okay, I hope you're able to see me now.
Yes, we are.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Oh,
Right.
yeah, I couldn't hear you. Yeah, so I'm Rhodian Munyenyembe, a lecturer in theology and religious studies here at Mzuzu University. Like Felix said, of course, I was head of department for the past 6 years. You can only be head for 3 consecutive terms. 3 consecutive terms of 2 years each. My interest is mostly in African theology and then the African philosophy to some extent, and then the church history, and lastly, sociology of religion. Apart from that, I think I wouldn't say much, but I would like to say that I'm a Langham scholar, if you know Langham scholars or Langham graduates. Let me go straight into the presentation. So you might have noticed that in the advert, the title reads "The Place of African Philosophy and African Theology in Decolonizing the Theological Curriculum in an Online Age." I tried to reason with Felix to say that there is a broader title to the chapter, which reads Epistemological Contextualization, but he convinced me that we shouldn't include it in the advert. But when you read the book, the chapter in the book, actually, you will see that the title reads Epistemological Contextualization, the Place of African Philosophy and African Theology in Decolonizing the Theological Curriculum in an Online Age. So let me go to the introduction. The theological curriculum in Africa is yet to be fully decolonized because the church has not fully embraced the disciplines of African philosophy and African theology. So that's my observation. So I argue to say that without mainstreaming African philosophy and the African theology in the theological curriculum, solutions for decolonization will be less effective. If we go to the historical background, you will appreciate that the church's penetration into Africa coincided with European colonization, which actually influenced its approach. We know that there were some good missionaries who did not really have the colonial mentality, but in terms of the age, we can all agree that it was part and parcel of the same movement. The church in Africa was initially a Western affair because of that, with evangelization emphasizing Western initiatives. As Tito Tieno has observed, wittingly or unwittingly, missions in Africa contributed to the making of the black man into the white man. And so the first generation of Africans who had embraced the Christian faith, they started to do what we call spontaneous theologizing. They were trying to make sense of the faith according to their own understanding of reality. So you see that this spontaneous theologizing in some cases actually even led to breakaway churches where some Africans formed what are known as African independent churches because they didn't really want to discard the Christian faith, but they came to a realization that the faith as brought to them from the Europeans was not really touching their heart. And so they wanted to express the Christian faith in their own way. This is that sorry, there is some background noise, but it's okay. Yeah, so you will see that African theology has not become a popular subject in many African theological institutions, and that African theologizing has not been mainstreamed into the theological curriculum in Africa. And that is very clear as indicated by the theological curriculum that we have in many of our institutions. But you'll notice that after the spontaneous theologizing that I referred to, which actually led to the establishment of African independent churches in some quarters, African philosophy and African theology as disciplines, they are not there at that time, but they had to emerge at some later point in time. And then because of that, we see that decolonizing the theological curriculum involves freeing Africans from Western intellectual constraints expressed through African philosophy and theology. So African philosophy emerged actually as a reaction against Western ethnocentrism and aimed to rehabilitate Africans from dehumanization. There is a scholar by the name Blessed Temples who was not an African as such, but he was one of the missionaries who were on the side of the people they were serving. So he had a sympathetic approach towards African culture. So he said, and I quote, anyone who claims that the primitive peoples possess no system of thought excludes them thereby from the category of men. So this is what Temple said, because what happened was that after the colonization of Africa, or maybe I should say, when the Western culture and African culture faced each other, the Westerners had a lot of negative things that they said against the Africans. And one of them was even to doubt the humanity of the Africans, because according to them, they were of the view that Africans did not really have any system of thought, so to speak. That's why Blessed Temples came in to argue to say that anyone who claims that primitive peoples possess no system of thought excludes them thereby from the category of men. So you can see that even the word primitive in those days was just being used casually. But of course, you know that in contemporary scholarly discourse, we no longer encourage the use of such terms. But I've used it because I'm quoting from a scholar of the time. So this led to the development of African philosophy as a discipline. And then we see that early African philosophers aimed to prove Africans' capacity for reason, leading to what is known in the study of African philosophy as the ethnophilosophy, where philosophers study the cultures and the thinking patterns of people of different ethnic groups. So African philosophy and African theology emerged around the same time with almost the same goal. And the goal was to rediscover the identity of the African and also to recapture what we call historical initiative so that Africans could be in control of their own narratives and not just to be described by the Westerners. So we see that because of the emergence of African philosophy, which was a wider intellectual movement, African theology as a discipline, specifically for the sake of Christianity, also emerged almost during the same time. So we see that African theology emerged in the 1950s, seeking to establish a genuinely African church free from European control. African theology aimed to redeem African traditional religions and marry the gospel with African cultures. So that was the goal. But because of several developments, we see today that African theology has diversified into areas like enculturation, liberation theology, African feminist theology, and also in other several sub-branches where it addresses issues like social justice and many other contemporary issues, including environmental issues, corruption, and so on and so forth. So I want now to talk about the case for African philosophy and African theology in decolonizing the theological curriculum. I argue that African philosophy is essential for understanding African worldviews and thought systems. And in so doing, it would actually benefit African theologians. So which means that studying African philosophy alongside African theology enables a critical perspective on African realities. African philosophy offers a broader intellectual arena, which if embraced by theologians in various theology departments and maybe theological institutions, would actually enable them to challenge coloniality. The relationship between African philosophy and African theology, we see that African philosophy and African theology both address African personal identity issues, making them crucial for decolonization. So what I see is that these disciplines are yoke fellows in the task of decolonization. And yet, we see that the church failed to embrace African philosophy and the African theology. How do I know that? When you look at the Catholic Church's way of doing things, you'll see that philosophy as a discipline is mostly promoted in the Catholic faith. And yet, even within Catholicism, it hasn't fully encouraged African thinking. Why is it like that? In the chapter, I do explain that it is because of the international character of the Catholic Church, in the sense that it wants some kind of international uniformity. So even though there are insights from philosophy, you will find that those ideas don't really trickle down to the grassroots so that people can be transformed and revolutionized. When it comes to the Protestant side, Protestant institutions often lack African philosophy in their curriculum, relying on historical perspectives of African traditional religion, mostly. So you find that in many Protestant theological institutions, they do teach African traditional religion, but not disciplines like African philosophy and African theology. Some evangelical Protestants do not even teach anything to do with African traditional religions. I've heard colleagues who went to some colleges saying that in their colleges, they didn't even learn anything to do with African traditional religion, which really is a problem, because then one would say, so how would they understand their religious or spiritual background with their Christian theology that they are learning, if there was no chance for them to learn anything to do with African traditional religion? So I see that if the church's failure to embrace these disciplines has perpetuated a colonial theological curriculum, sometimes leading to the persecution of advocates of African philosophy and African theology. In certain instances, people don't want those that have studied these disciplines because they think that they are liberal in the negative sense of the term. So if you look at such things, we realize that without promoting African philosophy and without promoting African theology, what we are talking about in as far as decolonizing the theological curriculum in Africa or in Malawi is concerned, you find that this may not really work. The reason being that for each and every society to advance, it is supposed to benefit from insights that are actually drawn from research. So if we don't promote African philosophy and we don't promote African theology, it means that the church will not benefit from the discoveries or insights that come from the research activities of these two disciplines. Therefore, getting epistemological insights from African philosophy and theology is essential for decolonization. So I see that promoting these disciplines in theological institutions as core subjects is crucial for the church in Africa. My observation has been that in institutions where these disciplines are actually offered, you'll find that in most cases they are electives and they're not really core subjects. And you wonder why should these subjects not be core subjects in an African institution, which is supposed to benefit from African philosophy or philosophizing and African theologizing, but it doesn't happen like that. So I see that the church needs these disciplines. But apart from the church, these two disciplines are also useful for society in general, even as we head towards 2063, as explained in the Malawi Vision 2063, but also the Africa Agenda 2063. There we are supposed to do so many things, but one of them is for us to change our minds, to embrace what is known as a mindset change. But how can we embrace mindset change when we are not reflecting on our reviews? How can we experience mindset change when we are not looking at how we reason, how we look at things? And yet, for us to be able to do that, the insights can only come from disciplines like African philosophy in the wider intellectual context, and also from African theology from a specifically Christian perspective. Now, because of that, we see that we cannot go very far without making use of these two disciplines. So in this article that I wrote, I was trying to plead with the fellow theologians or fellow academics to say that if we really want to contribute towards the decolonization of the theological curriculum, then we cannot neglect the two disciplines. So in short, this is what I wanted to present by way of summary from the chapter that was published in the book that Felix showed us earlier on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Let's give him an applause for a great presentation. Short and very brief, and exactly getting the point. So I'd like to open up the floor to questions, especially questions. We can do comments much later. but would like to start off with questions. So if you can raise your hand, you're good to go. I'll give you the mic, and let's ensure that we switch off our mics if we're not speaking. Okay, so let's go to Alex. Let's take 3 questions. So the first one will be Alex. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Doc, and thanks for the good presentation. My question was, of course, you did mention about some of the challenges, but I think I've only captured one, whereby some schools or some theologians have not yet rent ATR. that's a challenge of one of the challenges that we can face in this process. However, I wanted to find out what are other challenges have you encountered, or the process is encountering in as far as this process is concerned. Thank you.
Should I be responding to each question, or should we wait until there are 2 or 3 questions? We can't hear you, Felix. I think you are unmuted.
Yes, that's right. Sorry. I was saying, I was thinking we could do 3 questions at a time, and then you answer them. But it doesn't seem like there's anybody else with a question, so you may as well go ahead and ask. I mean, an answer. Sorry. You're muted now. You're muted.
Yes. So what I was trying to say in relation to ATR was just an example to show that in some theological institutions, you will find that the curriculum is very much Western in its configuration. So much so that subjects that matter for the African context are not even in the curriculum. They're not even promoted. So I was just giving an example of African traditional religions that in some institutions, they don't even teach that. So I explained that in relation to my earlier explanation to say that for us to be able to respond effectively to the African context, we need to understand African culture, we need to understand African reasoning, we need to understand the African worldview. And that's what African philosophy is all about. Now, in many Protestant theological institutions, you find that these disciplines are not taught. However, they do teach African traditional religion, and that's what I was trying to explain. But I said the problem with the African traditional religion is that in most cases, it's taught from a historical perspective, so much so that contemporary issues that matter are rarely discussed. But at least you can give credit to where ATR is included in the curriculum. But I was lamenting the exclusion of ATR as a subject in some theological institutions. I'm not trying to mention the names of the colleges here because I don't want to expose them or maybe to show that I'm negatively disposed towards their approach. But the thing is that in some of these institutions, they don't have African philosophy, they don't have African theology, they don't even teach African traditional religions. And yet the people they are training are going to go and work in the African context. So how do you expect them to contextualize whatever theology they are learning if they are not engaging with the African cultural context, especially as far as its theology, spirituality and worldview, the worldviews are concerned? So that's what I was trying to say. And I look at that as a problem because it means that we are not taking the African context seriously. I don't know if that makes sense to you, Mr. Alex Business.
Yeah, of course.
Oh, great. But just a little bit of an anecdote. Well, you mentioned Dr. Tieno. So I remember sitting with Dr. Tieno, and he asking me, so you went to African Bible College and you did not do African theology? And, I felt like, yeah, right. And I think this is true. And I don't think it's something that, we should be skirting around the issue. I think most Western missionary Bible colleges seminaries, they don't take, African theology and African philosophy seriously. Yeah. So we've got another question. Ken has a question. Do you just want to say it out, Ken? And I saw you just read it on the chat.
Yes, so there is a question there.
Mm-hmm.
Let me read it. Thank you, Doc, for the presentation. My question is about the methodology used and the theory, if it was incorporated.
Mm-hmm.
And then, okay, so that the other one is just a comment. I, for one, did ATR at EPCOM, but not at ABC. I concur with your observation. Okay, so this was not, okay, let me start with the methodology. The methodology is that I consulted literature on African philosophy and African theology, and I also had interviews with colleagues from various theological institutions to gather information from them. I also looked at the curricula of various theological institutions and the departments of theology and religious studies in the institutions. So the overarching theory wasn't really, I mean, I wouldn't really say that I used a particular theory. This is it's an article that I wrote in order to push an argument. And my argument was that if we are talking about decolonization, which in this case would be decolonial theory or decolonial kind of thinking, the thing is that there are readily available subjects or disciplines that can help us to move ahead with the decolonization of our curriculum. And what I saw was that there was a gap in the sense that the disciplines which I think are useful when it comes to redeeming the African mind are actually not being promoted in many of our institutions. So this was a plea, actually, to say that for us to take decolonization seriously in the context of theological education, we must embrace African philosophy and African theology, because these two disciplines directly contribute to the decolonization of the African mind. I hope that answers your question, Sandy.
Exactly. Thank you so much. I was afraid asking my professor.
I thought as much.
No, in the academia, we always discuss issues, so there isn't, there are no hierarchies. Even though Felix was saying he was my boss at Mzuzu, nobody is anybody's boss. So, yeah, we are all students, so some of us have advanced in certain things, but we're also learning about other things and so on and so forth. So I think in as far as this chapter is concerned, I was just trying to reflect on what I had learned from African philosophy and African theology as disciplines. And I was quite passionate to say that if we can promote these disciplines in our theological institutions, then it would contribute towards decolonizing the theological curriculum. So that actually was my aim.
Agreed. Any other questions?
Well,
Yes, Godfrey, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation, Prof. Hearing from your presentation concerning how the Catholics do their philosophy in the seminaries and whatnot, and also the comment that came here concerning that some academic institutions do not offer some of the programs that are related to African theology. What should be done maybe to address this question? Perhaps maybe we can move to the good direction. Thank you.
Dr. Munyenyembe, go ahead and answer it.
Yes, thank you very much. I think It's exactly what we are doing now. You know, before there was no theological society in our country. And now there is a theological society where people can come together and share ideas. And of course, we can do research and publish whatever we have unearthed. And in this presentation this afternoon, I am making a plea. Of course, not now, because this was published a long time ago. But this was, I think I presented for the first time in 2021. So the idea is that within the society, we have people from different denominational backgrounds. So as a theologian, I'm speaking to fellow theologians. So if we have theologians here who are from the Catholic tradition, maybe they can take it up and see how to apply such things in their context. And those that come from other spirituals, other theological traditions as well, whether Protestant, evangelical, whatever, they may also learn one or two things. I think that's why books are published. So you can't really force your ideas on people. But if you put your ideas in a book and people take that book and read it, and if they feel that the ideas presented therein really make sense and they can actually contribute to whatever they want to do, then they can make use of them. So it wouldn't be proper for me to say we should advise the Catholics to do things in this way, or we should advise the Anglicans to do it in this way. It doesn't work like that. So as an academic, you can write something and then you publish it. Now, whether people will make use of it or not, that's not for you to tell, unless you put on another cap as an activist, and then you start lobbying and advocating for that. So here, it was more like a very mild kind of advocacy or lobbying from a theological perspective. But I know that it's not easy to change churches or denominations to stop doing things the way they used to do and start doing them a different way. It may not really work like that. But what we are trying to do is to encourage people to rethink the way they are doing things so that they can incorporate new ideas and perhaps start doing things differently. And I think to give the Catholic Church credit, if you look at the history of the Catholic Church, it has been changing and embracing new ideas, I think, in the course of history. For example, they had to make some changes during the Vatican II, and then later on, I think it was 1994, we came up with the African Synod, where African bishops would sit down and discuss matters from their own perspective, and then from there, you could see them implementing some of the things that they agreed. For example, the liturgy of the Catholic Church today has been Africanized, so to speak, in what they call contextualization or enculturation. So which means that in one way or the other, the ideas gained from African philosophy and African theology are being utilized in the church, even within the Catholic Church itself. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you, Prof.
Any other questions? I guess my question for you, Doc, is, I guess one would be, what would be the starting place? I guess for a lot of us that, have gone through the traditional Western seminary, or is it colonized seminary? We are hard placed to think of where we start from, especially African philosophy. So who would be the go-to philosophers, or those that we can draw from in terms of building a decolonial African theology?
Are you asking me that question?
Yes, sir. That would there be any pointers you point at that such a philosopher, African philosopher, would be a starting place? Because I'm thinking that for many of us it may be something that's even new. So where do I start from the whole corpus of African philosophy?
Okay, so thank you very much. I think that agrees with Michael Muhango's question. Would you create a short program on African theology and African philosophy for the 5 related courses? I have not done ATR2. I don't understand what he means by for the 5 related courses. Anyway, but what I'm getting from there is that he hasn't studied African traditional religions. Now, African traditional religions can be studied from various angles, and I don't think I have the time to explain all the angles. But there is a book that has just been published. I think it was shared on the Theological Society Forum, the one which I edited together with Louis Ndeka. Ndeka and myself are editors of this book, a first shift for Professor Joseph Chakanza. I think you have seen this book.
Yes.
It was actually shared free of charge. Do you remember seeing it?
No.
No?
I know of it, but I didn't know it was shared free of charge.
I saw Louis Ndeka. I think Louis Ndeka shared it on the Theological Forum. The whole book.
Oh, the e-copy. Yes, that's right.
An e-copy. Yeah, an e-copy.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what I'm trying to say that ATR can be studied from various angles, and in this book we have tried to explain the methodology. In the preliminary chapters, I've tried to show how people have studied ATR from the beginning and what are the changes that have taken place over the years. Which means that we can come up with several courses on ATR, depending on whatever approach one has decided to take. And now on the short course program on African theology and African philosophy, if there can be a market for such short courses or short programs, I think I would readily do that. Now, to agree with Felix's position, the thing is that if you haven't studied that and you are completely blank, you can start by looking at some very simple textbooks in African philosophy. There are some very simple textbooks in African philosophy for beginners, so that at least you should just understand how African philosophy as a discipline studied, or how African theology as a discipline studied. And then from there, you get some kind of a historical background to the discipline. And then from there, you go to maybe handbooks or encyclopedias, where you can read different themes that African philosophers or African theologians grapple with.
Mm-hmm.
And apart from that, of course, if you want to be contemporary, then the best way would be to expose yourself to current journal articles that are being published in these two disciplines. But of course, without a course outline of some sort, it's not easy for people to follow. What I have discovered is that, from each and every institution may have its own approach as far as the course outlines are concerned. But if you're talking about a short course, I think we can just put in the most important things for people to know, so that at least you can grasp the basics of African philosophy or the basics of African theology. Once you have grasped the basics, I think for other things, it's just a matter of you getting to read more and more, and then you understand what is supposed to be known. You have to engage with the scholars who have published in the field. That's what happens. But I know that things vary from one institution to another. For example, when I was an undergraduate student at Chancellor College, African philosophy was a course that we could study in 2 semesters. So that section 1, which we studied in semester 7, and then section 2, which we had to study in semester 8. So which means that we had to spend a lot of time studying that. But that was the experience at Chancellor College. But wherever I've gone, I have seen that these courses are taught in just 1 semester. So maybe we need to consider the planning as well. How much can be grasped within a semester, and how much can be grasped maybe within a year, and so on and so forth. But for someone who just wants to get introduced to the course, I would also recommend online materials. You can read various things, or even watch YouTube videos where some lecturers try to explain what these disciplines are all about. Yeah.
Great. Any other question, people? Maybe even comments now? We're running out of questions. I
would like to know if there is one who has ever studied African philosophy here among the participants. If we have an African philosopher here or an African theologian who did the African theology.
By way of reading for a class to teach.
No, but studying it as a course at either in the university or seminary.
Good afternoon. I'm Fulata. I did study African theology at University of Zimbabwe.
And actually, you were my lecturer in African theology.
Ah, I'm guilty.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, you taught me African theology as an undergraduate. Of course, at that time, you used to combine classes. So I was in the 3rd year, but some guys were in 4th year, but you used to combine the 2 classes. So I learned African theology from you, and I learned African philosophy from now Professor Devala, who is in South Africa.
And it looks like 2 of your students, Dr. Munyenyembe, are here saying too that they did philosophy and African theology at Mzuzu. So we have 3 generations here.
Okay, so I think these have just joined now. I didn't see them at the beginning.
Yeah.
Okay, there's only one person actually.
Yes, Bridget. Yeah.
Yeah, so Sunday is saying he did African theology at Nkoma University. Yeah, so which means that in some institutions they are teaching these courses, even in church-related institutions. Because previously these courses were only in the universities. But okay, there was only one university in the past. Then later on, of course, at Mzuzu University, the courses were introduced, but not in the theological seminaries or theological colleges. But I think now it's good that they are being introduced there. I think people have seen the importance of these courses for the church. That's why they are now teaching them in theological institutions.
We have another question from Dr. Moya. Please go ahead.
Yeah. I joined late, so I might be asking something that you already talked to, probably. Having lived abroad from Malawi for some time, I've realized, I've found out, like here, many people, when they study theology, even when it is very contextual to their context, they don't call it names like European theology or Swiss theology or German theology. And I've often asked them, like, when you're talking about theology, I mean, which context? And they will say, oh, it's theology. It's either it's theology or it's you can't name them like that, like Swiss theology and all that. And I think the assumption for them is that the theology that they teach or they learn is the so-called classic theology, and then all the other theology that we learn in Africa and other parts is the one that we call African theology or whatever else we call them. I would like to hear you comment on this because there is a way in which when they make that comment, it looks like our theology is just a footnote of their theology.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question, Prof. I think what we have to understand is that we are coming from a background where to be European or white, Western was the norm. And to be other than that was something else on the periphery. If you go to the United States now, maybe you don't, okay, no, maybe not even going there, but I think if you follow what is happening there, there is this comedian, Trevor Noah. I think we know Trevor Noah. Yeah, so he makes fun of white Americans by saying they are the only ones who are not described by any place of origin. So you don't have Americans of European origin. You don't have British Americans or Irish Americans or French Americans. So they are just Americans. But then you have people who have come from other places being defined by their origins. For example, Americans of Indian origin, or Americans of African origin, or African Americans, and so on and so forth. Even so according to him, the people who are supposed to be original Americans are the indigenous Americans. But then the indigenous Americans are not just known as Americans; they are also labeled. They are also labeled. So if you are coming from a background of European or Western imperialism, you will understand that those of us who have decided to study disciplines that could as well be studied in Europe, but we are giving a name to them. It's because we want to emphasize what is important to us. I think that's what Tito Otieno talks about in his article entitled "The Right to Difference." So the right to difference, where he explains why African theology and why African philosophy is to show that as Africans, we are people who have different experiences from our colleagues in Europe, or maybe the Western world in general. Now, the Westerners, of course, used to take things for granted that everyone else should study what they are studying. Now, if you are looking at disciplines like mathematics, for example, or maybe the natural sciences, that's not a problem, because for those disciplines, it doesn't matter whether you are studying from Africa or from Europe. There is no African mathematics or no European mathematics, whatever. But when it comes to the humanities and social sciences, they can only be useful if they are contextual. And that's why contextual theologies came on the scene in the 1970s. People in Asia realized that they can't just be doing theology when what they are doing just to parrot the Westerners' theology. And people in Africa also felt that just studying theology, the way theology was being studied from a Western perspective, was not really scratching where it was itching for the African. And therefore, there was need to contextualize. That's why third world theology started coming on the scene. So the reason for us to call our theologians African theology, they can indeed be considered to be a footnote to the real European or Western theology. But what you have to know is that each and every theology is supposed to be contextual. So when we say African theology, we're not trying to say that this is different from what is the real theology, but what we are trying to say that we are emphasizing on the contextuality of theology in the African context, so that our theology should make sense to our people, unlike copying things that happen in Japan. Because if we take the way the Japanese do their theology and we bring it here, it can be some kind of Christian theology, but it will not be scratching where it is itching in our context. You see, so you find that the Westerners took it for granted that everyone else was studying what was useful, only to discover that the African was left behind. That's why African theology has to come in. So the nomenclature itself can indeed be debated, but I think the issue is contextuality. Whether you call it African or not, what we are trying to say is that theology has to be contextual. I think that's how I can respond. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And that's a very concrete and serious response. And I think, I'm sorry that I'm speaking again, but
No, it's okay. Go ahead, please.
But I think that emphasis is very important, because as you say, what is called just the theology without putting a context of it, usually we know is very contextual. I mean, because people look at it from their own perspective. There is it's like a biblical interpretation. You can't say my interpretation is classic. We always look through our own experiences of the encounter with God. And so I think for the West, most of the Western theologians, especially if you are talking about European ones, they still have not come to a point where they want to let go of the colonial mentality. So we shouldn't get tired naming ours the way we do and be proud about it and not feel that our theology is inferior to their theology. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. And I don't know, maybe it's just a point. I don't know if it's a comment or a question, but how much of this, talking about classic theology or just theology without any adjective is really a masking of a white supremacy. That there is this idea that theology that is done, by white people, by the Westerners, the Europeans, Americans, that is theology, and that everything else is not theology, meaning to say that their theology is a superior theology. I feel that we also need to do the unmasking, of the subtle, white supremacy that is, in theology and even in our theological thinking here, where we take on, hermeneutical principles that, are inherently white supremacist in a sense, that they suppose that they are superior to the ones that we would develop here. I feel like we've not really dug into that area to basically say, no, you can't say that your theologizing is superior just on the basis that it's Western. I don't know what you'd say to that, Dr. Munyenyembe and even Professor Amoyo.
Okay, so let me start by thanking Professor Moyo for her contribution and also seeing merit in what I tried to explain. I'm humbled. Yeah, so the thing is that we sometimes tend to distinguish between what we call classical theology or traditional theology and then the contextual theologies. I think your emphasis on white supremacy, I think that's where the problem comes in. There is this issue of whether David Livingstone or some other explorers really discovered what they claim to have discovered in Africa. We can explain that and understand it better from disciplines like African theology and African philosophy. So I'll give you an example. So when people say, is it true that David Livingstone discovered Lake Malawi? So for me, I say, yes, it is true that he did that, but he did not discover it for us. You see, the thing is that he was the first of his stock of humanity to see the lake, and therefore, okay, the people who were living along the lake shore, for them, the lake was something that was there. So he did not discover it for them. Now, when he reported what he had seen, he reported that to his home country, his only countrymen. And then they said, okay, so David Livingstone has discovered Lake Nyasa at that time, or maybe the Victoria Falls and so on and so forth. Now, what I'm trying to argue is to say that it is true that he indeed discovered, but he discovered that on behalf of his own people. He did not discover it for us. But because we were colonized, the curriculum in Malawi was heavily influenced by the colonizers. And therefore, the issue of who discovered Lake Malawi was there. So for a child in Scotland, that would make sense. Who discovered Lake Malawi? David Livingstone, for them. But for us, I mean, we would read a question to say, who discovered Lake Malawi? And then we say, David Livingstone, when our people were living here. So the thing is that the curriculum came from Scotland, and it came here. And of course, there it was true that David Livingstone had discovered Lake Malawi. But when it came here, we're not supposed to take it wholesale. We would say, who was the first among the Scottish, or who was the first among the English to see our lake? And then we would say, okay, David Livingstone was the first to see our lake among these people. Not that he discovered for us. But I think you can see that the problem is because we did not contextualize the curriculum. That's why we ended up parroting that stuff. I think maybe up to the time when we were in primary school, even up to secondary school. Maybe it's only now that they are changing the textbooks. But this is what we are learning, you see. So the thing is that We Africans were considered to be on the periphery. At the center was the European. So everything else was determined from the center. And we were dancing to the tune of the European. So everything European was the norm. Everything African was the exception, you see. So that is the problem. So there is no such a thing as a classical theology against other kind of theologies. But if we can talk about the classical theology, some scholars think that perhaps it's that theology that goes back to the first 4 centuries of the Christian faith, when actually theologizing at that time did not even take place in Europe. It was mostly in Africa, and then it went to Asia, you know, Eastern Asia. If you talk of people like St. Augustine, Cyprian, Athanasius, all those, they were not European at that time. Okay, it was happening in North Africa. So from the beginning, African theology, when we are learning African theology, we know that as a discipline, it is a recent phenomenon because of colonization. But in as far as the theologizing in Africa is concerned, it is something that started from the dawn of the Christian faith. So we don't really need to compartmentalize it or maybe to cut it into chunks and say this is for Africa, this for that. The whole theology is one. But because of colonialism, Africans were eclipsed, so to say. And I think we are naming our theology in order to re-establish our position in the theologizing enterprise. Thank you.
Oh, great, thank you. Dr. Moyo, any comments?
Well, I mean, thank you, Professor Munyenyembe. You've really answered it well. I mean, because I think at the end of the day, it's also the way we ourselves have enabled the colonial mentality to be sustained. Because if we, but I know there is an old Yoruba saying, an ancient Yoruba saying, which in the Yoruba context where, you know, you had to show your courage by killing a lion. The saying goes, unless lions can tell their own story, the story about their hunt will always glorify the hunter. So I think now that we are telling our own story, we are writing our own theologies, we are pushing to tell it from our own perspective rather than allowing the colonial mentality and the colonial perspective to be the voice that actually submerges our voice. So let's continue to write and let's continue to tell our own stories, and let us have confidence, because you see some of the things that have sustained these mentalities, that the theology when I was doing my master's, sorry, I'm going astray a bit, but when I was doing my master's before my PhD, at the University of Zimbabwe, there was an insistence that you should do Greek and German. And if you were doing theology, you at least had to do German as a language, because the theologians used German language. And I remember a group of us reacted and said, no, English is already one or colonial language enough. We don't want another colonial language. We reacted, and so they said, okay. So we were let off the hook because of that. But I think at the end of the day, I remember after 1 year, I said, oh, I think I should have done German, because all the theology that I need to help me with my studies is in German, you know? And it brought a kind of like a low self-esteem to my theologizing. And I think we are at a crossroad where we have to actually have the confidence to say the theology that is cooked in the African pot is not a junior theology, it's not a footnote. It's actually an authentic theology. As the Munyenyembe has said, the first theologians actually were from Africa, North Africa. So yeah, so let's have the courage not to name all good-looking dogs as a Garwa Chizungu, but let's actually own good things as our own things.
But Prof, coming back to you with that question, I mean, with that issue, we would rather get our PhD from Cambridge, Bonn, and Princeton and Yale and Harvard than here. Isn't that more better? What do you think?
Can I start responding to that?
Yes.
Yes, I think he mentioned you specifically.
It's me specifically.
Yeah.
Okay. For if you know, my PhD, I did it in South Africa, in KwaZulu-Natal. But those who know, they know that actually I had a scholarship to Yale University. So I did some coursework at Yale University, and I had the chance to stay there and finish there. But I refused because I said the theology I'm doing makes more sense than in Africa. And there were so many times people told me that you missed a chance because if you had completed it in Yale, your status would be very high up, But going to Africa, so I think there is this mentality we need to kill. Because even among ourselves, when we tell people where we got our PhD, where we got our masters, we always have like one shoulder high if we did it in Europe, we did it in the US, than if we did it in Africa. Let's not be like that, because of course, there are times when we complain about maybe we don't have as many resources in Africa and whatever. But to tell you the truth, I can tell you for sure, I worked much harder doing my studies in Africa than I could have done if I continued at Yale, because at Yale, everything I said about Africa, my professor believed it. She didn't have any clue what I was saying. And I could have gotten away with so many things if I continued there. So let's be proud with our own institutions and also know that actually the quality of our education, most of the times at postgraduate, actually, it is driven by you as a student rather than actually by anybody else, because you are the one on the steering wheel. So, yeah.
No, thank you. Thank you. Another question from anybody else or a comment?
Yeah, a comment. I just want to thank Professor Moyo for that explanation. And I wanted to give credit to the first generation of African theologians, more than the African philosophers. African theologians, the generation of Mbiti and others, I think they studied in these so-called Western universities that we're talking about. Of course, maybe they came back and then they taught in African institutions, but their professors were Westerners. And yet, after they had done their theology, they did not continue with the Western tradition. So they are the ones that gave birth to this African theology that we're talking about now. So what it means is that even if you can study under Western philosophers, Western professors, if you are critical enough, you will know the theology that matters in your context, and you will concentrate on that theology rather than parroting the theology of your Western professors. And I think this is a good example that we get from people like Mbiti and others.
Oh, great, thank you. Dr. Munyenyembe, back to you. Another question for you. What do you think about Professor Augustine Mosopole's Umuntu theology? Would it fit what you're talking about?
Yes, I think it does, because I think understanding the concept of Umuntu or Ubuntu or whatever from an African perspective, of course it has its own limitations, but it is something that we discuss in African philosophy. And I think the understanding there is a way in which we understand personality or personal identity in African philosophy. And the Umuntu is a concept that I think is very much celebrated. And I think you know that at the core of Umuntu, I think it's the way humans relate with one another, whether you are African or you're not African. But of course, the emphasis on Umuntu is that this is what makes a man in the way he or she, or in the way they relate, I should say, with one another. So yes, this is something that people discuss in African philosophy. And I think Musopole was also an African philosopher. He did African philosophy, and he was also a theologian, and he wanted to use that insight into African theologizing. Yeah, I think it makes sense. But like I said, it is a concept that people discuss and debate, just like the African concept of time. You know, people sometimes criticize Africans that maybe we are not quite punctual when it comes to keeping time and so on and so forth. And then most of the observations are negative. But then when you read contemporary philosophers, you will see that there are some positive things again from the African concept of time, which in most cases we demonize. But there are also good things from there. So in the same thing with the Umuntu theology, I think generally it's a very good African concept, and if we really use it the way it's supposed to be used, we can transform our society. But I think in most cases we just pay lip service to what it means to be, to promote Umuntu.
So would you say then that the book by Professor Musopole would be a good beginning point, as people are asking about, resources for African theology and African philosophy? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, so I wanted to say, for a beginner, I wouldn't recommend that book.
Okay.
I think it makes sense if someone has already grasped some basics in African philosophy and African theology. Yeah, so I think for a beginner, it's better to read simple textbooks. There is a book, for example, if you want to read African, if in African theology, I think you can start with John Parrott, even though now the text was published a long time ago. I think they are most recent publications. But for me, I think for the old texts, John Parrott was a good introduction to African theology. And also Howard Shorter. But in African philosophy, I recommend Ochieng Odiambo, An Introduction to African Philosophy. It's very simple and straightforward for a beginner. And then from there, you can now keep on going into deeper waters.
Oh, great.
Yeah. So sometimes when you read monographs and the journal articles, sometimes they don't really make sense to a beginner, because they are assuming so many things. When they write in such a way that I think they have at the back of their mind that the audience understands what they are saying. But I think for an undergraduate student, for example, or someone who's just beginning, it's better to start with the simplest textbooks, and then from there, that's when you can start reading monographs or journal articles. But you can't start with monographs or journal articles because the language is just too deep for a beginner.
Oh, great. And Doc, you mentioned the issue of mindset change and Malawi 2063 in your discussion of epistemic contextualization. Do you think that there's any other, I do not know, discipline or field that is really interacting with that idea of mindset change? And I got the feeling that you were saying that in African philosophy would help us in terms of mindset change, in terms of helping us to reflect on what has happened before. Yeah, so do you think there's any any space where that is happening, the reflection, that is.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, it is happening in the sense that I think even as we are discussing now, we are saying, let us challenge white supremacy and so on and so forth. So the only discipline that can equip you to be able to challenge white supremacy better is African philosophy within the broader intellectual context. But of course, if you want to look at it from a Christian point of view, then African theology, of course, would come in. The only challenge with the African theology sometimes broad and people approach it from different angles. So some angles may not be very helpful. And I've seen course outlines from some institutions where they teach African theology from a pastoral point of view, but the emphasis, I think, is only on pastoral care and not on challenging the powers that be, for example, and maybe challenging people's perceptions on a reality so much so that we can be able to engage with people of other races or other countries. So I think it depends on how you have configured the content. Apart from that, you can call a course African theology without necessarily making it a very critical kind of course.
Oh, great, thank you so much. I'm looking at our time. We are almost running out of time. We have 3 minutes to go. I do not know if there's anybody with a pressing question or a comment that they should just say. They feel like they must say that comment. Okay, well, it seems like we have none at this point in time. And yeah, I would like to thank you, Dr. Munyenyembe, for availing yourself for this time and this very important discussion on the post-colonial decolonial group. You know, we've had all sorts of things coming in, but we've never really come at the point where we actually are discussing things that are specific to this. And so thank you for availing yourself. I'm sure we can clap hands. Yeah. And next month, I think it's going to be on the 12th of April, we're going to have, from the book again, we're going to have Dr. Takuze Chitsulo, and it's going to be chapter number 12 in the book, and it's called Contextual Bible Study, Constructing Interpretations that Have Decolonizing Effects. Contextual Bible Study, Constructing Interpretations that Have Decolonizing Effects. And so, yeah, I hope you are going to avail yourself. I'm sure we've had a good time just discussing these things. And again, let's make this also a place where we network. If you see somebody that is talking about things that you'd like to know more of, you know, contact them. If you feel like here's a topic that we should speak more of on this forum, you know, let me know. We'll definitely, you know, have somebody that can come and facilitate and help us understand those things better. Any last words from you, sir, Dr. Munyenyembe?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to you for organizing this and also for the people who participated. I don't take their time for granted.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I'm quite passionate about this. Of course, my argument is fully developed in the chapter, so I would like to encourage those that haven't read the book to read the book, or if they are interested in this particular chapter, to read this chapter from the book itself. Thank you.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you. May I ask Kenneth Sunday if you can close us with the word of prayer?
All right, let us pray. Our Father and our God, we are so grateful. Thank you for the opportunity that we could learn and forge ahead as a people. We appreciate your love and grace. Apart from that, thank you for the academic minds that are shaping, Father God Almighty, the rhetoric of our times. We appreciate such in the name of Jesus Christ. And as we disband this meeting, God, we pray, may you protect us until the next time. It is in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Amen.
Thank you so much, everybody, for taking the time to be here. We'll be in touch. We'll have that other meeting in April on the 12th of April, I believe. Yeah. Thank you so much. God bless you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks. Bye.